Lincoln. So the news came out,
Sure.
when was it? I think a couple of days ago. So according, I think it's the story that broke it, I think it was The Guardian. Multiple sailors aboard the Abraham Lincoln, the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, have attempted to jump overboard as its crew faces mounting mental health pressures during the extended deployment supporting operations against Iran. I think this is the longest deployment of any carrier ever. I can't remember what it was, 200 days or something, 250 days. The carrier's roughly 5,000 sailors and Marines are in their ninth month at sea and have spent a record 250 consecutive days without making land. Families have raised concerns about severe burnout, deteriorating living conditions, and inadequate support aboard the ship. Reports describe moldy showers, broken toilets and laundry facilities, shortages of hot water and basic hygiene products, and limited food. Several suicide attempts have been thwarted aboard the aircraft carrier. One wife said her husband had tried to jump overboard after his spell at sea kept being extended, adding, quote, "He's scared." She received a call about the incident after her husband jumped, but has not heard from anyone within the Navy in several weeks. In one of many incidents, a sailor on watch spotted a shipmate preparing to go overboard and intervened, pulling them back onto the deck. In another incident, watchstanders prevented a crew member from jumping from the carrier. The carrier originally deployed in November 2025 for operations in the Pacific, but was redirected to the Middle East after the war with Iran began, with its planned return repeatedly postponed. So that was a story that came out, I think, yesterday or a couple of days ago. And then a story that came out today with text messages being leaked. There it is, text messages from service member aboard the USS Lincoln. You can show the messages, Paul, obtained by journalist Aaron Parnas, highlight dire conditions during the carrier's prolonged deployment linked to operations against Iran, including shortages of fresh food and basic supplies. The sailors said they had no milk in 3 months and that the ship has received virtually nothing fresh but meat because it could be frozen. Fresh fruit and other food cannot survive the lengthy supply journey, with some shipments arriving rotten. The service member described the deployment as the worst one, saying even sailors with extensive deployment experience considered it their worst and believed it can't get worse than believed it can get worse than this. They also expressed frustration over repeatedly extended time at sea and being kept away from their family longer than expected. The sailor said another crew member he met in the smoke pit had suggested the deployment is an experiment by the government to determine how far it could push sailors' limits of being out in the sea with the worst experience. Yeah, and there's a picture of the food as well. You can show that, Paul. But how significant is this, Matt? What's your reaction? What do you make of it?
Yeah, I think the morale factor is extremely significant, and there are some things that should have been predictable when this war was begun, because these ships were previously provisioned by the Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. So fresh food could be bought locally or even flown in on C-17s, refrigerated pallets, things like that, and then transferred directly to ships that are nearby, even including by helicopter in some cases. The stuff that really counts for morale, like fresh tomatoes and things like that, because all they're eating now is canned stuff, so canned peas, canned everything, and it gets pretty old. I was in my time on active duty in the 80s. I was not assigned to a particular ship, but my SEAL platoons would ride on various ships. So I got to spend a few weeks to months on, 8 or 10 different ships, different types of ships. And there's a huge difference between a smaller ship, relatively speaking smaller, like a destroyer, or in those days frigates or LSTs, which had a crew of 200 or 300, 400 men, and where the whole top isn't just a flight deck. On these ships, you're never more than 100 feet from being outside. You can walk a few hundred feet and you're open that door and you're looking at the sun and the sky. On the aircraft carriers, and I've been inside of them, I never deployed on a nuclear carrier, CVN, like Nimitz class, but I deployed on LHAs and LPHs and things like that, pretty big helicopter carriers. And if you don't have a job on the flight deck and the ship is involved in flight operations, like 24/7. If you don't have a flight deck job, you just don't wander up onto the flight deck because it's a dangerous area. A lot of things are moving around, and you're basically living inside of a steel box. So if you're talking about an aircraft carrier that's longer than 1,000 feet long, it's divided into, literally hundreds and hundreds of little metal boxes connected by, in the Navy, they're called passageways. Like a hallway is a passageway. And because these aren't pleasure ships, and every square foot has to accomplish something, the ceiling is only a little bit over 6 feet high, like less than 2 meters. So you're always, the ceiling, you're always conscious there's pipes and wiring right at your head level. And the passageways are basically only wide enough for two people to pass each other without, having to turn shoulders. So that you can touch both sides of a passageway. And you're living inside of this for weeks at a time without ever seeing the sky, because they may say the weather decks are secured, or in this context they may not want people on exterior, what they call catwalks, which are like a side deck made of open steel material, right, that won't collect water. But there are lifelines around them and so forth, but if people wanted to jump overboard and they left with the mission of jumping overboard, they couldn't be stopped. So I think that the number quoted of 6 people having attempted it, I think that they might be have talked about it, told their shipmates, I can't take it anymore. I do believe that. There's another report that 7 people were killed in fighting. I don't believe that. I think that's just a story being whipped up, going around. But there's no doubt that the morale is terrible.